This is the second of two videos looking at Xin-Wen Li's defense of what she calls the wide-scope deterrence theory of punishment. The first video looked at what she called narrow-scope deterrence theory. I'll very quickly review what was in that video before discussing Li's proposal for updating it. Traditional narrow-scope deterrence theories focus on the power of punishment as providing reasons to perform or not perform certain actions. These theories are built on two assumptions. The first of these assumptions is what's called the capacity assumption. The assumption that potential offenders are rational agents who are able to build facts about the severity and certainty of punishment into their deliberations when deciding what to do. The second assumption is called the deterrence assumption. It's the assumption that when potential offenders figure in the cost of punishment, they'll find it to be a sufficiently strong reason not to perform the criminal act or to perform an act that's legally required. Li identified a number of limitations to narrow-scope deterrence. It doesn't work when agents aren't rational, which could be as a result of a long-term mental illness, or short-term effects of extreme emotions or addictions, or even a lack of sleep. Also, narrow-scope deterrence doesn't work when people judge that the punishments are worth the risk. This happens when corporations and individuals face small penalties compared to their ability to pay, but also when civilly disobedient actors judge the cause one is fighting for to be worth the cost. Similarly, imprisonment doesn't deter when life outside of prison is worse than life in prison. We also argued that if one accepts the deterrence theory of punishment, this implies that punishment isn't justified unless the punishment being used actually serves its goal of reducing crime. In the same way that's a poor idea to use a screwdriver to pound in a nail, current forms of punishment might be doing a poor job of providing deterrence. In this context, Li mentioned the following: prisons becoming schools of crime, prisons becoming a place in which one can be guaranteed food, shelter, and medical care that one can't find outside of prison, and long-term prison sentences acclimatizing people to the criminal community and criminal culture. In light of these considerations, Xin-Wen Li recommends that we consider a different conceptualization of deterrence theory, one which she calls wide-scope deterrence theory. What distinguishes a wide-scope theory from narrow-scope theories is that wide-scope theories include the use of internal sanctions in addition to external sanctions. External sanctions, as mentioned above, are those sanctions, rewards, and punishments that are bestowed on the individual by external forces, by the government or the community. Internal sanctions come from within the individual and are built into the individual's character and values. Li draws inspiration for this idea from the teachings of Confucius. She provides the following quote, "If you try to guide the common people with coercive regulations and keep them in line with punishments, the common people will become evasive and will have no sense of shame. If, however, you guide them with virtue and keep them in line by means of ritual, the people will have a sense of shame and will rectify themselves." End quote. This thesis draws on the observation that most people who obey the law don't do so out of a fear of punishment. They don't take somebody else's property because it belongs to somebody else. They refrain from rape and murder not because they fear getting caught, but because it's not the right way to treat people. The same applies to keeping promises or refusing to cheat to win a game. It's an internal drive, something that's a part of their moral character. A study which placed wallets around for people to find had the interesting result that people are more likely to return a lost wallet that contains money than one that doesn't, and more likely to return a lost wallet that contains more money than a wallet that contains less. They aren't being motivated by external sanctions, but an internal sanction. And by the way, in case you're curious, Switzerland was the most honest country, China the worst, and the U.S. was nearly in the middle. So Li argues, since internal sanctions are effective at preventing crime, and since preventing crime is the goal of punishment, at least under a deterrence theory, punishment should aim at promoting these internal sanctions. It should be noted that Li doesn't advocate eliminating external sanctions and using only internal sanctions. Li wrote, quote, Although deep deterrents are more effective in crime fighting, we should not rely solely on them, as we can't be sure that all offenders will receive education or treatment programs well. Thus, a prudent deterrence theorist must embrace both shallow and deep deterrence tools." End quote. At this point, it would be reasonable to ask how we're going to go about creating these internal sanctions that would motivate people not to engage in criminal behavior. Lee doesn't address this problem specifically, and to be honest, to study potential answers to this question, one would need to take a course in criminal psychology. What's relevant here is that it's inconsistent and incoherent for somebody who justifies punishment based on deterrence to be sloppy about the use of external sanctions while ignoring entirely the potential deterrence effects of internal sanctions. A consistent and coherent application of deterrence theory to punishment requires considering how to implement internal sanctions. One of the problems with narrow-scope deterrence is that it's only effective when there's a risk of being punished. External sanctions have no effect on those who can avoid those sanctions. Or, as somebody I knew when I was in high school was fond of saying, it ain't illegal if you don't get caught. Internal sanctions, unlike external sanctions, are inescapable. A person can't run away from their own conscience. External sanctions will prevent somebody from taking money from a coworker's desk when they think they might get caught. Internal sanctions will prevent somebody from taking money from a coworker's desk even when they know they won't get caught. In Lee's words, quote, "However, non-prudential moral reasons are deep deterrents because a believer in moral principles will avoid committing criminal offenses even when no punishment will ensue. For this reason, deep deterrents are preferable to shallow deterrents." End quote. Internal and external sanctions can also be expected to function differently on matters of civil disobedience. We can expect that the internal sanctions associated with the violation of an unjust law would be less than those associated with the violation of a just law. Martin Luther King's declaration that unjust laws may be disobeyed while just laws should be obeyed tracks the effect that internal sanctions would be expected to have in these two types of cases, assuming that one could accurately tell the difference between just laws and unjust laws. So that's the theory. Now let's consider some objections to this theory. One of the objections can be expressed as follows. What are we going to do now? Teach the philosophy of Confucius to prisoners? As Lee states the objection, quote, "Modern liberals may be concerned that Confucius's solution is based on virtue ethics and therefore incompatible with liberal respect for individual autonomy and state neutrality." End quote. In another passage, he writes, quote, "If we teach them one particular comprehensive moral doctrine and tell them that anything that contradicts that doctrine is false, then our teaching is paternalistic and violates the principle of state neutrality." End quote. So, to put this objection in more general terms, Lee's proposal may be said to contradict the principle that government should remain neutral on matters of religion and ethical teachings. Lee answers this objection by denying that the lesson that she draws from Confucius is the adoption and enforcement of any specific moral philosophy. She's drawing from that tradition the insight that the developing of internal sanctions can be an effective way to reduce criminal behavior. If it's legitimate to use external sanctions, which are violent and harmful, to prevent certain types of actions, and internal sanctions are more effective, this implies that we should be developing internal sanctions as well. Furthermore, even the modern liberal must recognize some limitations of tolerance with respect to the value systems others may adopt. Burning witches, human sacrifices, killing apostates, even modern liberalism places some limits on tolerance. The principle that would be applied here calls for the widest degree of tolerance to the systems of belief that produce these internal sanctions. Lee wrote, quote, "If we just teach them moral philosophy, Aristotelian ethics, Bentham's utilitarianism, Kant's categorical imperative, egoism, the harm principle, or even legal moralism, the approach is not paternalistic." End quote. After all, we teach different moral theories in universities. Why not teach them in prisons? A second objection to Lee's theory is one that Lee doesn't consider. In authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, we sometimes see what are euphemistically called re-education camps. These camps take dissidents and protesters and re-educate them so that they learn to obey the state. We can imagine somebody like Martin Luther King being sent to prison so that he can be taught to internalize the Jim Crow laws of his day. One way to avoid this outcome is to completely prohibit attempts to indoctrinate prisoners. We lock them up for committing their crimes, but make no attempt to alter what they think or what they value. Narrow scope deterrence or external sanctions don't violate this principle against trying to influence somebody's values. It's only the attempt to create and impose internal sanctions that violates that principle. There's a third family of objections that I'm going to mention but not going to go into here in any detail because of time. These objections were built into an influential movie and book called A Clockwork Orange. In the novel, a gang leader by the name of Alex is arrested and subjected to a set of experiments that are meant to condition him, as one might condition a dog, not to engage in violent criminal activity. The book made the idea of conditioning people, as one would condition animals, very unpopular. To summarize, deterrence theory says that the purpose of punishment is to prevent people from committing crimes. External sanctions provide a useful form of deterrence, but it has limits. Another way to effectively prevent people from committing crimes is to produce internal sanctions, the type of sanctions that actually keeps most of us obeying the law most of the time. Internal sanctions work even when there's no chance of being caught. The person sees themselves as somebody who just doesn't do that kind of thing. Objections to the use of internal sanctions include: 1. The state should not select a morality and require that prisoners learn that system. 2. It runs the risk of making it legitimate to establish re-education camps against those who are judged to be enemies of the state or the regime in power. And 3. It involves conditioning people like animals. With respect to the last two objections, Lee didn't consider those objections. It's worthwhile to consider how Lee might answer them. But I'll have to leave that for another time.